Good morning and welcome to the Green Recovery and Just Transition, the first in our series of 24 enlightening sessions being held during Dcarbonise Week, Virtual Sustainability Summit, a pre-COP26 event that features some of next month's milestone event sponsors and a host of true luminaries on highly topical and relevant panels. I'm Judith Patton, Project Director and co-creator of All Energy and the co-located Dcarbonise. Creation in the last 18 months has not been of in-person events, but a compelling series of webinars. 30 between May 2021, no, we're in 2021, aren't we? May 2020 and March of this year. I'm year challenged, that's for sure. They attained well over 18,000 registrations and more than 20,000 views. Now, here we go with Dcarbonise Week. Just one tiny housekeeping point. Check out what lies behind the resources tabs. You can see what is up next, find a full program link, the digital bag, and information on next May's All Energy and Dcarbonise. 11th and 12th of May are the dates for your diary. Naturally, we'd like to thank our sponsors. And for the first 3 days, these are our brand sponsors, ScottishPower, Shepherd and Wedderburn, and Ørsted, whose names you'll see alongside certain sessions close to their hearts. And our session sponsors, Hitachi ABB Power Grids, Kellis Midstream, SSEN Transmission, SWEP, and Driving the Electric Revolution Industrialization Centres. And thank you for being with us today, speakers, and all of you in the audience, some 230 of you, I believe. If you enjoy the session, let us know, and also let your colleagues know they can watch on demand. Now, without more ado, I'd like to pass over to Lindsay McQuaid of ScottishPower Renewables to get the show on the road. Over to you, Lindsay.
Thank you, Judith, and good morning, everybody. As I join you, just a stone's throw from where the COP26 conference is going to be held in Glasgow, just 4 weeks from today. So very exciting times in the city, seeing us warming up for what is going to be a critical set of discussions that need to take place if we are going to have a fighting chance of staving off what is a very critically timed climate emergency if we're not careful. So yeah, it's just a lot to think about when you get your head around it. We've got 4 weeks until that date. There's going to be good, fantastic discussion over the course of the Dcarbonise event this week that Judith's just prefaced, and I'm very much looking forward to being part of that. I guess warming up for what's coming, and here's hoping to COP being a successful event. So this session is titled The Green Recovery and Just Transition. One has to go with the other, absolutely is a must. We can't afford to leave anyone behind, and it's important that we do enable that green transition as quickly as possible if we are to have a fighting chance of dealing with the climate emergency. Green recovery has become a much used phrase, particularly over the last 18 months, 2 years. It has to be the type of recovery that we are targeting. And it's important that as we come out of this pandemic period, we tackle the climate emergency as effectively as possible and establish what will be that new normal and not slip back into bad habits. At ScottishPower, I get the privilege of being up first and getting to tell you a wee bit about our organisation. The journey to green has been very much part of our DNA for quite some time now, having been involved in the wind sector since the 1990s. And not just that, we've ditched coal, we've got rid of gas, and our 100% of our generation fleet is now renewable, which is fantastic. I appear to have frozen on screen. Can you still hear me? Yeah, Kate's nodding, thank you. So yes, it means that all the power we generate comes from the 40 sites that we have located across the country. That's just over 2.8 gigawatts of capacity, enough to power over 2 million homes. And what we're planning on doing in the next 5 years is doubling that. And those that were attending the Conservative Party conference last night, the Scottish reception, would have heard that If we can get it to go faster, ScottishPower stands ready to go further, and we would very much like to increase that capacity and our commitment and contribution to getting to net zero. So that further and faster message, that change with pace, is absolutely something that we are focused on. And to get us where we need to be, we're investing already £4 billion to 2025. That's within the renewables business. Across ScottishPower, we're actually going to be investing £10 billion across that period, covering renewables and networks. And that will enable the connection that we desperately need so that homes and businesses all across the country can benefit from that green power. And we're aware that, you know, it's not just about the colour of your electrons that flow into your home, it's about how you're using them. And it's about the role that every individual and every individual household has in that transition. Well, we have no option but to all be on that path. So whether you're an individual household, community, business or government, we all have to be working together to enable the change that needs to happen. A good colleague of mine in the industry coined a phrase a few years ago, and it seems particularly apt, that we are the first generation to truly understand what the climate emergency is. And unfortunately, we are the last to be in a position to be able to do something about it. That's incredibly challenging, but also very, very exciting that we have to get on board with. It can be daunting for individuals to figure out what their individual contribution could be to that challenge, but every little helps. And least of all, when we had the pleasure of opening our first corporate PPA wind farm with Tesco earlier on this year. And that's just a sign of the change that's coming. Corporates and consumers are very interested in the colour of the electrons that are now powering their lives, whether they're at home, whether they're on the move, whether they're at work as well. It's important that they have access to clean and green energy. Our Carling Cross wind farm earlier on this year as well. Carling Cross was one of the first repowered site that we had. That's an excellent opportunity to take old technology, replace with new, but we've not only done that with wind. That site has now been augmented with battery storage, and solar panels have started to go in the site as well. It's the first energy park that we've developed, and that's now the model that we will be pursuing to ensure that we make good economy and efficiency of the connections that we have, the infrastructure that we have, and to ensure that we have that storage capacity dotted around the country to enable grid resilience and provide services to National Grid. With innovations like this, creating investment the length and breadth of the country, we have wind farms from the very south in Cornwall to the very north up at our Ben Tarzan wind farm. They support jobs, businesses, communities and supply chain the length and breadth of the country. And I'm particularly proud of the fact that at ScottishPower, we've actually analysed our sites to have 66% UK content. And I stand ready to meet the challenge of attaining 70% for those sites that we're talking about with new investment. That means that I'm going to need people, I'm going to need skilled individuals to come along. And I very much welcome the work that we're doing with the likes of Dumfries College, where we recycle our used consumable parts from our wind farms to train technicians of the future at a local level. That's important that we have boots on the ground close to where we're making our investment to support that. Scotland obviously is a bit of a world leader in everything that's going on as well, and we are also pursuing our offshore wind ambition. We have East Anglia 1 now fully commissioned, East Anglia 3 consented and waiting in the wings to participate in the next CFD auction, hopefully to be joined by 2 further sister sites as well. But that's only the beginning, with processes like ScotWind that have been launched by the Scottish Government and already trailed as having a second auction round in this Parliament. That shows you the level of ambition that we need to have and the pace at which we move. It's fantastic to see those opportunities coming through, and also fantastic to see front page of most of the headlines this morning talking about every home in the country being powered by green electricity by 2035. That's something that ScottishPower stands ready to contribute to, and through onshore processes, offshore processes, whether that's for leasing, route to market, corporate PPA, we need to make this all happen. So in just a short month, COP26 gets underway. we're already part of that journey. We want to share our story and enable others to start that transition as well. And I very much am looking forward to the discussion this morning about the speakers' views of the green transition, the green recovery and the just transition, and how they view that. So really fantastic panel, followed by our quick fire round, and we're going to cover all the main technologies. Offshore wind is absent from this session. That's quite deliberate because it's got a whole session to itself following immediately after this one. So we'll talk about wave and tidal, solar and onshore wind in the quick fire round. But first up, I would like to welcome Chris Stark, Chief Executive of the Committee on Climate Change, my esteemed industry colleague, to kick us off with his opening remarks.
Thanks, Lindsay. Just checking you can hear me. Great, fantastic. Well, thanks so much for having me this morning. I'm really pleased to be here, fresh from legging it back from the school gates this morning. Still glowing from the morning ritual of shouting at my kids. So very pleased to see you all. And I wanted to kick things off this morning just by reminding everyone how momentous the next few weeks is going to be for climate policy in the UK. And also uniquely how important that might prove ultimately to be for the rest of the world as we shape up for COP26 and of course the UK presidency. So it's going to be a heck of a few weeks. The stakes are very, very high. And I don't think it's overstating it to say that our credibility in this global role that we have as COP president does rest on having a compelling domestic programme for climate change in this country, especially as the global attention starts to focus on Glasgow this month. So that's what I'm thinking about. I think everyone should be looking forward to that too. It will have an important bearing on everything that we do, I suspect. More important than all that diplomacy stuff, though, our ability to actually meet the ambitious targets that we have that were set from Holyrood and Westminster really rests on putting a proper policy programme in place. And to, that's going to have to steer a lot of change over the course of the remainder of this decade. So I'll be honest, I feel like I've been drumming my fingers a bit on this for too long, waiting for this strategy from UK government and also from the Scots. It looks like we will finally understand how this starts to fit together a bit more with, certainly from the UK government, the net zero strategy and of course the spending review and the budget happening on the 27th of this month and scheduled deliberately to be days before COP26. So it's shaping up to be quite an interesting period. So the green recovery, if there's going to be such a thing, is going to be shaped. It's going to be driven by what we are about to receive. And that is quite an exciting moment. But I thought I'd be controversial for a second. I don't know whether the notion of a green recovery is what we should really be seeking anymore. The recovery of the economy, that is the fundamentals as we come out of this pandemic, needs to be shaped fundamentally by this climate stuff, the climate imperative. And I actually think we need to move away, frankly, from the narrow idea of green this and green that and properly mainstream carbon neutrality now. So I've been doing a fair bit of reflection recently, not least because there's a delightful gang of people who are very sceptical about climate change, sceptical, of course, about net zero, openly against any additional cost to the economy as we pursue this goal. And they were doing quite a lot of attacking of us and others recently. And I've found it's quite interesting watching them. They found quarry with some of the lobby journalists. That's the folk who deal with, the political soap opera, the gossip. And what's interesting about that is that they see net zero as something fairly tokenistic, something that's marginal at best, the kind of green stuff. But this audience knows that it's not that. This is about wholesale change to the whole basis of our economy. So I've started to wonder recently whether we are marginalizing this challenge by adding that green label. This decade really is a one-off point, a one-off period when we are going to be able to steer the ship in the right direction, to put the economy on a stronger footing for the long term. It just happens to be zero carbon. We will not do that if we lock in the old fossil fuel paradigm that we are used to. We won't have time, and I suspect we won't have the resources either, to reverse from the poor decisions that we might make today. So we need to be making provision for the huge shift in industry, in jobs, in skills that's coming. And we need to do it at speed and across the economy. It needs to be viewed as something which is more encompassing than just a green recovery. And the other problem I have with the green recovery is that we face such a different set of circumstances now from those that we were predicting, say, 18 months ago when the pandemic kicked off, when that term green recovery came into common currency. The labour market has been successfully propped up by the furlough scheme. There may yet be a jobs crisis, but it doesn't look at the moment like it's going to be one of mass unemployment. We've got a gas price spike at the moment, reminding us just how exposed we are still to imports of fossil fuels at a time of huge global demand as the recovery proper starts globally. Fuel poverty is now a huge concern in the UK. The cost of living is now the big political challenge. If we look at politics across Europe, North America, the rest of the world, they're now by the new climate politics in a way that they weren't just 18 months ago. Just look at the Greens in Scotland now in government, the Greens in Germany about to be in government. Look at Joe Biden's infrastructure bill in Congress. Look at what's happening in China, which is really starting to make some decisive moves towards the President Xi's climate commitments. Everything feels to me at least like it's in flux. And when I look back at the ambitions for a green recovery last year, I think they were too narrow. I think it's clear that many of us got it wrong. We don't need the kind of demand stimulus, for example, that many were calling for. What's happened is consumption has roared back after the pandemic, but investment hasn't yet. And that's what I think we need to focus on. What we need to do is to make this a period when we move away from the traditional approach of getting the economy going by trying to boost consumption towards something that is a genuinely investment-led recovery. I prefer that term, an investment-led recovery. That's the exciting challenge for me. That's the tantalizing prospect of net zero. The major infrastructure, the major investment requirements of carbon neutrality in almost every corner of the economy. We estimate that's an extra £50 billion pounds of investment per year for the UK. We've got to get serious about that challenge, pulling every lever that we have, the fiscal policies, the regulatory policies, public spending, private finance, all in the name of catalysing that extra investment that will get us to net zero. And we've started to do it. We heard from Lindsay about some of the projects she's been pushing from ScottishPower. You can tell that the process has begun in the UK and the Scottish Government's plans and strategies so far. But I think this is now the kind of the famous squeaky bum time. Ultimately, high carbon assets are going to have to be turned over to low carbon alternatives. Jobs are going to be created, but some are going to be lost too. We can't really duck that in this transition any longer. We need to work across the economy, not in narrow sectors. We've got to be guided by all the technical analysis that we've been doing and others on how to get to net zero. We need policy to drive the change over the coming years with that long-term outlook that builds confidence in the private sector, confidence to build supply chains, confidence in installers. We need to stimulate zero carbon investment. Most of that will be private at as cheap a cost of finance as we can through those long-term policies. Yes, we've got to innovate, but we've also got to learn by doing so we can bring down the cost for the consumer. That's going to be such an important issue now. And we need to think of this at scale, scaling up deployment of low carbon technologies as they reach maturity. Most of them have, and they're ready for the mass market. All of that's possible. Crucially, all of it's worth it as well on a host of grounds, not just on carbon. And that maybe brings me to my final point this morning, which is about the other theme of this session, and that's the just transition. More and more, I feel that is the real issue. The aggregate cost of tackling this challenge of getting to net zero is now low when we look at the overall challenge for the economy. It's not just in this country; it's in other countries too. And I think we can reasonably expect that cost to fall in the future. So the real challenge is actually in spreading the costs and the benefits as fairly as possible, planning as best we can for the jobs transition that we know will come. We're in a fairly unique moment right now, where broadly we know what the demands for skills and labour will shift towards in the future. We can never know that with precision, but we do know the big story here. So we need to plan for that kind of change, or we're going to face bottlenecks in the transition. We're going to face a lot of anguish over a badly managed industrial transition. We've had those before in this country. So a fair transition is the thing I want to see more focus on now. How the fiscal tools can help us to capture the benefit in some areas of this transition and make the costs, the real costs in other areas, more palatable. How we will genuinely engage people in this country to take them with us on this transition, and how we can actually level up. We're going to be hearing a lot about that this week, of course, but directing that huge wall of investment to the areas that need it, especially the ones that were left behind in previous transitions. Final point from me, I think there is so much room for creativity here from our politicians. We do need that kind of grand political visioning, not thinking of this as a narrow green recovery, but really leaning into this now and describing net zero as something which is much more broad and fundamental to the modern economy. Government policies that are made today, if they're bold enough, are going to have lasting positive impacts throughout the coming decades. So I'm really looking forward to hearing a bit more about that from our politicians. And I'm also really looking forward to having something to chew on from the government, something new, because I hope it's going to give us at the CCC some cause to go back to our own modelling, to start revising the pathways that we provided for you last year in December, to try and reflect the new political priorities that are coming from the Scottish and the UK governments. It's really exciting, and I hope this is the moment when we start to bring all that together. When we get that kind of political top-level engagement, I think we'll be motoring, and we'll be talking about recovery proper, not just this narrow idea of a green recovery. So with that, I'll stop.
Thank you, Chris. Great words to make us think, particularly like your reference to the decade of difference. We need to pull the finger out and really get on with it. So next up, we have Bruce Adderley speaking. Bruce is the Challenge Director, so hopefully he's going to get us all thinking this morning of Transforming Foundation Industries, part of the UK Research and Innovation Council. Thanks, Bruce, and welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Yes, as has just been said, I'm the Challenge Director for Transforming Foundation Industries. So I know most people this morning are about to speak about different parts of the energy sector. But as Chris said up front, our challenge is about the whole of the economy and decarbonising to meet net zero and meet the targets that we've got over the coming decades. So I'm going to speak for 5 minutes or so about how I see that in the foundation industries context. Now, first of all, foundation industries is a term that some of you may have heard, but many of you may not really be familiar with. So here I'm talking about the metals sector, chemicals, cement, glass, paper, ceramics. Yeah, these are all really important sectors of our economy. And as Chris and his team highlighted in the 6 Carbon Budget report at the end of last year, they have a really important part to play in decarbonisation of the economy, starting right now. Yeah, in the next 10 to 15 years, significant steps in reducing the carbon emissions from these sectors in all its forms need to be taken if the rest of the economy is going to be supported. Now, these sectors supply the materials that are needed into energy, construction, packaging, automotive and aerospace, just to name but a few sectors that are important to the UK. Now, my next statement is going to be a little bit controversial, a little bit black and white, but it's what I've seen over the past 25 years. And that generally it's been a bit of a take situation for these sectors. They've tended to be a bit of a servant, right, and the customers have been the master when it comes to decarbonisation activities over the previous period. Often there's been demands been made of them, which they've done their very best to make when normally they have been operating with small margins. And that's meant that they've struggled to reinvest at scale in this country in particular. And the investments that they need to make are massive. I admit, like the same as in many other sectors, but to get the scale and capacity that we need, we're regularly talking about investments of hundreds of millions, if not billions of pounds to make the changes that we need. Now, I'm pleased to say that is changing. And if we look at organisations such as the World Economic Forum at a global level, they've recognised that we can't make this transition without bringing the material sectors along with us. In the UK, the Aldersgate Group is saying exactly the same message. Yeah, that material resource efficiency must be an integral part of our green transition and the decarbonisation that we need in the coming decades. So the companies in those groups and many others are now, I'm pleased to say, more and more beginning to work with the foundation industries to address this. And I think this gives us a real opportunity to immediately get on and see these industries directly incorporated in the steps that we need to make. For the UK, this is particularly important in terms of the levelling up agenda, Many of these sectors operate in regions right across the country where that's an issue. And in the past, they've seen instances where industries have gone under or changed rapidly, and the individuals, the workforce on the ground, haven't felt part of the transition that happened in that period. And it's really important that this time around we get that right, and that everybody who works in every company is an inherent part of what we're trying to do. So I'll reference a couple of reports if this is not an area that you've particularly come across before. Late last year, the CBI, Make UK, the Institute Directors, the British Chambers of Commerce, and the Federation of Small Businesses came together and put out a report on just transition to net zero. Within that, they outlined kind of 5 areas, 5 principles that I'm not going to go into the detail of now, but hopefully you'll be able to find for yourself. The principles that they in areas that we need to look at as we're doing the transition, and those are our ambition, the accountability that companies and individuals need to take, how are we going to deliver, the scale of the opportunity, and in the end, what the cost is going to be. But I thought they made one extra key point, and that's something very much I've seen over the past 18 months or so, whilst we've been getting the challenge off the ground. And that's that the bigger companies, yes, they do tend to have budget and are able to take certain actions, but these sectors are absolutely jam-packed full of small and medium-sized companies who are going to need support in this transition. If you think about the sectors I've mentioned, steel or cement or whatever, probably most of you can bring to your mind 4, 5, 6 big companies in those sectors. But across the 6 sectors I'm talking about, as I look at what I'm trying to do with the challenge, my list of companies that I'm targeting is 4,000 plus. And the vast majority of those are small and medium-sized companies, and they need support as we undertake this transition. The second report I'd point you towards is one that had a bit of more of a regional focus. It was produced by the New Economics Forum back in June of this year, and it was entitled Powering the Just Transition. And they had a series of actions that they felt needed to be taken, or a series of ways that we needed to work as we did the transition. You're not going to be surprised that it included that we need to invest in low carbon training, jobs, and infrastructure to prevent those communities that I've talked about earlier becoming stranded as we make the transition. I believe, along with them, that a regional approach is going to be needed on many occasions. As I look at what we're trying to do on resource efficiency within the challenge, it's quite clear that making some of the most the best resource efficiency moves you can is by working with the people within your region, and a number of regions, I'm pleased to say, are now starting to make moves in that area. But it's interesting that they also focus on applying just transition principles throughout the supply chain. They're saying it's vitally important that that happens, and that all companies in the chain and all the people that work for them are involved. And that's become abundantly clear as we've moved my challenge from being on a piece of paper to now starting to push out innovations into these sectors. Now, I emphasize the word push there because the reality is, as we've gone on, we've realized more and more that innovation desperately needs to be pulled as well. And that there's a big piece for us to undertake, certainly in the coming decades, to get a new way of working in terms of innovation for these sectors and their customers coming through. And I'd go so far to say, and using a different definition of this word now, that pull needs to be demanded by their customer base and us as individuals. So we need to get the foundation industries focused on delivering innovations in terms of decarbonisation into their sector, but we need to be prepared to work with them as partners in solving our material efficiency conundrum. That has to be a part of the decarbonisation jigsaw. So I feel that whilst we're only part way through the Transforming Foundation Industry Challenge, it's already time to start thinking about what needs to be added Yeah, we need to start developing supply chain demand-led initiatives. And in terms of the supply chain, we need to look at the customers for the materials that I've been talking about, whether they're in the private sector or whether they're the public sector's buyers. There needs to be a commitment made that these green products are going to be bought if they're brought to the market, and that you're prepared to work with the foundation industries to deliver the solutions that are needed. We're definitely beginning to see this, and I'm pretty sure that something significant in, say, the packaging sector is going to appear very, very shortly. But there's no reason at all why this shouldn't be pushed through the construction sector as well, and a number of the other sectors hopefully won't be far behind. So I think right now I'm saying we need to have a push to drive a demand-led solution to our resource efficiency problem. There's no reason why we can't do this across the economy, and that if we do, there's a real chance that we can get these industries and the communities that are socially, economically dependent on them being an inherent part of a just transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce, and very well put. You're right that these industries are so critical to our way of life, and they just need to figure out what we all need to figure out, how they can contribute to the just transition and whatever colour of recovery Chris has got us going for now, but it has to certainly be a cleaner, lower emissions recovery as well. So great, thank you very much. And moving on to our next speaker, very pleased to welcome Julian Leslie, who is the Head of Networks for National Grid ESO. Julian, thank you for joining us this morning. Can everybody hear Julian okay? No. Julian? Got an issue? Julian, I wonder if you wouldn't mind, I don't know if he's already disconnected and he's going to reconnect. So I guess while we're waiting for Julian to come back, I'm going to abuse my position in chair and maybe come back prematurely to Chris and Bruce and maybe have a bit of impromptu Q&A. Julian, I see you're back. Wondering if we can hear you? Not quite. Right, okay. So, Chris, you alluded to the whatever colour of recovery we're going to have, whatever that's going to look like. I guess in terms of pursuing that rainbow recovery or whatever we're going to call it these days, are we really hitting the mark? Are we going to get there?
Well, we're not hitting the mark yet. I mean, I think it's important to say that we've got a recovery, but it doesn't look very green. So to go back to my other theme, I think the important thing is it can be. Now it looks by all accounts that we're going to see a prime ministerial commitment to fully decarbonise electricity by 2035. And that just gives you a sense, actually, that I think the government is thinking the right way about this down in Westminster, because it is an enormous effort to pull that off. We think it's necessary for them to do that. That was the basis of our assessment for the sixth carbon budget. And if that is confirmed, that's a huge commitment. But that gives you a sense of what a genuine, if we need colours, what a genuine green recovery would look like, would involve the infrastructure investment to deliver that kind of outcome. And with it, I mean, we're not just going to generate these green electrons for the hell of it. We need to be using those green electrons at scale across the economy, in the transport system and in the heating system and in industry. So for me, we haven't really got the kind of the bones of that plan in place yet. But it sounds like it's coming together nicely. So I mean, I'm excited for the first time in a while, actually, about what we might see from the government over the course of the next few weeks when it comes to the net zero strategy. And maybe the final thing to say on this is that the piece that's really missing is the piece on incentives. What the incentives for the consumer. Mm-hmm. And some other interesting hints recently that the government is also thinking that way about it. This is really the piece for Rishi Sunak. It's not going to be a challenge solely of public spending. And I'm afraid in the press, that's often the way it's described as being about, a spending review, maximum 3 years outlook. It's nothing to do with that. This is about changing fundamentally the incentives for millions of people across the economy, millions of businesses across the economy, to move towards those low carbon outcomes that we've talked about this morning. We haven't got that kind of plan in place, but I suppose the crucial thing is we could have very soon. And then I'll feel much more optimistic about whether we're actually on track for this recovery, whatever the colour is. Lindsay?
Yeah, good point. Yeah, I often feel that we've got a lot of declarations kicking about right now, but the details lacking. And I think that's where there has to be a great big push, certainly within the next 18 months or so, if we're really going to make this happen.
Agree. Yeah, agree.
Thanks, Chris. Bruce, if you wouldn't mind holding, I see Julian's joined us. Julian, I'm hopeful I'm going to be able to hear you this time. I'm still struggling, Julian, I'm afraid. Okay, right. Okay, your turn, Bruce, in the hot seat, I'm afraid. And hopefully Gillian will resolve his connection issues. So you talked effectively, I mean, the industries you're talking about, energy intensive industries, the amount of energy they use into making the materials that we so, depend upon in our everyday life. You can see that as being, the hard to get to area of the economy. They've got an upward battle. They've got processes that are hugely, I guess, dependent upon the role that fossil fuels are traditionally taken in there. Within Scottish Power, we're talking a lot about green hydrogen, and that balance of hydrogen versus electrification. And I guess one of our experiences, and not to steal the thunder from the hydrogen session that's coming up later on in the Dcarbonise agenda, very often there's a perception that hydrogen could be the solution, but actually electrification is an option. Are you finding that in the discussions that you're having with members of those sectors and industries?
So I think if you think about the big players initially, those big players are all going, right, am I going to go electric? Mm-hmm. Am I going to go hydrogen? Or am I going to go pretty much, more efficient, but more along the lines of what I'm doing now, but I'm going to have access to carbon capture and storage? Those are the big three plays, basically. And if you take steel as an example, those three options, as long as you're in the right place, and I'll come back to that in a minute, are open to you. Yeah, you could move away from coal-based, using big blast furnace steel making to electric arc furnace. Now, that isn't to say that there isn't a massive amount of innovation needed to ensure that you can produce all the products that you can today through a variety of routes through that route. You can look at moving to using hydrogen in blast furnaces and rolling mill furnaces and that. And you can certainly use carbon capture and storage, and that's something that I've been involved in for a long time, both when I was at Tata Steel and when managing the UK CCS Research Centre, as an option. But to touch on something I just said a moment ago, geography is also key. So again, it's great to see the progress that's being made on the large industrial clusters, and that certainly 2, fingers crossed, possibly 3 is going to get some significant funding in the next few weeks to take them forward to the next step, and then a route is emerging for another 2 or 3 regions after that. But there's an awful lot of those 4,000 companies that I talked about before who are not in those regions. Mm-hmm. If I look at ceramics, for instance, they're distributed around the country, and essentially, they're paying for energy what the likes of you and I are, and the price of electricity at the moment, it leaves them in a situation of they desperately want to decarbonise, and we're working with them to try and to get the different technologies ready so that they can. But at the moment, there's no way they could make that switch because they'd just go under. So there are problems to solve. The technologies are there, but I think I would just like to emphasise that we do need to look at what the solutions are for heavier industry, that aren't immediately in the really big emitting regions, because there are an awful lot of companies that will be in danger of, as a minimum, having to move location, and at worst being lost from those regions if we don't do this in the right way and make the right infrastructure available.
So having that regional support, and I guess having local agencies in place to support them as well, will be helpful. And if they're not part of a cluster, there is a danger of them being lost. So absolutely agree that there's a need to be looking for support there, and certainly UKRI and others will be.
Yes,
contact.
absolutely.
Great, thank you. I'm going to try and go back to Julian. All going well. I'm going to hear his dulcet tones contributing to this wonderful debate that we're having. Morning, Julian.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, thanks.
Yes,
Excellent. Third time farm. Brilliant. Okay, so Julian's head of networks for National Grid ESO, as I said. I'm very much looking forward to what he's going to tell us this morning. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for persevering with the technology. Good morning, everybody. So I'm head of networks and chief engineer for the electricity system operator. So I just wanted to talk about how we're seeing this decarbonisation journey from our perspective and sort of what we're doing to sort of progress this. So in 2019, we launched our ambition such that by 2025 that we could operate the GB electricity system at zero carbon. And we did that because we could see that the energy sector was massively decarbonising. What we didn't want to be, we didn't want to be a barrier to that, and we wanted to be an enabler. And with the progress that we've made from 2013 to 2020, with a 66% reduction in carbon intensity of electricity, and a similar sort of, well, an even bigger increase in wind and renewable output, such that last year, as many of you know, that renewables actually overtook fossil fuel generation on the system, which is a great achievement, but it doesn't happen by accident. And as the system operator, we've had to work very hard over the last 10 years to really think about how we operate the system and how we progress to operate the system as we decarbonise further. So what we're looking to do is to bring in these new services and these new technologies by what we call pathfinders, so running new tender processes to bring in things like inertia and very fast frequency response, things that previously we relied on fossil fuel generation to provide, but now having to find new and innovative technologies to bring that forward. So by 2025, we will have a position where for the first hour or 2 hours on a sunny, windy August afternoon, we'll be able to operate the grid system to operate at zero carbon for those first few hours. And it'd be just like the transition from coal, where we recognised that we had the first hour without coal, then the first day, and now we ran for 5,000 hours last year without coal. And it'll be the same with running the system at zero carbon generation. There'll be an hour in 2025 and then gradually increase as we get towards 2035, when we need to be able to do this 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So we're on track to do that. There are some unanswered questions that we need to answer, but we're working on a global basis, sharing our information and thoughts with other fast decarbonising countries, such as Australia, California, etc., and just sharing that thoughts and ideas so we can all learn together. But this transition does need to be a just transition as well. And through our future energy scenarios, you can see the role of the consumer and how much that they need to change their behaviour and devices in their home to become more efficient, but also such that their devices will run at a time of high renewable output, and then maybe using their electric vehicles or batteries in the roof in their loft to sort of think about when the renewable output isn't there to support the grid. But obviously that requires a lot of capital investment up front. And at the moment, from our sort of consumer research, that seems to be the barrier, that the consumers now, they sort of understand that the change needs to happen. It's just how do they make that happen, and how do they get that large input of capital to invest in their air source heat pump and electric vehicle, solar on the roof and batteries in the loft, and how do we make that accessible to all? The other thing that the future energy scenarios pull out is that there isn't one solution for everybody, and that a whole range of solutions need to be brought forward, because this is such a big challenge that we can't all put our eggs in one basket, and that many technical solutions need to come forward, and also on a regional basis, understanding the particular circumstance of a city or rural location or an industrial site or a non-industrial location, and really having solutions that are focused on that particular regional aspect. What a lot of this does need, it needs investment. It needs investment in the efficiency of housing. I think whichever way you look at those studies, and no regret sort of investment proposition. Enabling electric vehicles, so getting rid of the range anxiety and putting that infrastructure in place that electric vehicles can be purchased and people have confidence that they can get to their destinations. So we think that by 2030, there'll be around 12 million electric vehicles on the system, with 38 million by 2050. That needs a lot of infrastructure. But rather than being a barrier to decarbonisation, we believe that once those amount of electric vehicles are on the electricity system, that actually they're a useful tool to help the transition, such that they can sort of charge their vehicles when the renewable wind output is high, and then maybe if we have vehicle to grid functionality, then the vehicles go in power devices in the homes, whatever, as the renewables decrease. There is also a lot of investment in infrastructure, not only transmission infrastructure. I mean, our last recommendations out to 2035 showed that £16 billion worth of infrastructure, transmission infrastructure, needs to be built in order to connect the large-scale offshore wind and bring it ashore and then move the power to where it's needed. But also, if you look to the future as well, in terms of how do you deal with those weeks or those days where there is no wind and no solar, or little wind and little solar? So storage is going to be a key facet, whether that's hydrogen or whether it's compressed air in old salt caverns or whatever it might be. But storage is something which at the moment we can see within day storage, and lots of batteries coming on the system, and we can optimize that within the day. The challenge, I think, going forward is how do you optimize that over a week or over 2 weeks, as we've seen this summer, where we had a very extended period with little or no wind. So a lot of investment in that infrastructure also. But then people and training. National Grid Group, we issued something last year, done some analysis which shows that 400,000 jobs are required to get this net zero task and challenge ahead of us. So a lot of investment in people and training and capabilities required across the whole sector to ensure we can make this transition. And I think most importantly, as BEIS has recognised through the recent consultation on the future system operator, that all of this needs a whole system approach. That we can't work as an electricity sector in isolation from the gas sector, in isolation from hydrogen, in isolation from the distribution companies. This all needs to come together and needs to be a way that we can optimise the investments and the operability challenges, and make sure that as we move to the future, that all of the energy system comes together and works holistically together, driving best value for the consumer and making sure that we can rely on safe and secure energy sources for the future. Thanks, Lindsay. Back to you.
Thank you, Julian. Really interesting to hear, I guess, the role of the consumer changing. I think I've commented in the past that the consumers were largely passive. So long as they could put their telly on or charge their iPad, they probably didn't realise or appreciate where the electricity was coming from and what it would mean for them. So I think that the role of the consumer going forward is really, really going to change. And interesting as well to hear about ESO's response in terms of decarbonising those services that you procure from the grid as well. We'll perhaps touch on them later on during the Q&A. So if from the audience you have questions, please do fire them in. We're going to hit our short update round in our quick fire session that Judith's put in place, where we're going to do sort of 5-minute elevator pitch style discussions on technology, and then we'll head to Q&A thereafter. First up, I'd like to welcome my colleague, Kate Turner, Policy and Regulation Director for ScottishPower Renewables. Kate, thank you.
Thanks, Lindsay. I had a couple of slides. I'm not sure if that might completely blow the technology to put up, but if they're available, maybe they'll come on the screen in a second. So the story, I think, from an onshore wind perspective is further and faster. Lindsay used that term earlier, and I absolutely agree. But let me explain what I mean by that. Our journey has seen the development of 40 operational wind farm sites, generating over 2 gigawatts of renewable energy, enough to supply around 2 million homes. And coupled with that, we have a $4 billion investment plan over the next 4-year period. That's big, but it's only part of the story. The size and shape of our portfolio really does highlight the transformational journey that onshore development has made. When I talk about energy parks, I don't know if we can move to the first slide, but we'll see on that hybridization of sites with multi-technologies to maximise the efficiency of site really is the way forward. Our Carland Cross site in Cornwall, in fact, was one of the first UK wind farms, first UK hybrid energy park, which the Prime Minister came along to install the first solar panels at, complementing the existing wind farm and battery storage on the site. But our journey is reflective of the growth of the onshore wind sector over the past 20 years. The industry has developed into one that employs thousands of people, it's created whole new supply chains, and brings economic and social benefits to local communities. A third of the UK's wind power comes from wind. Power comes from wind, and that is a significant milestone. But Chris talked earlier about the need for policy to drive the change, and that's a phrase that I'll probably coin because it absolutely classifies for me what that needs to happen. And let me talk about what that looks like too. We've seen the re-inclusion of onshore wind in the next UK government contract for different auction, but we need to see a programme of regular annual CFD auctions for onshore wind and solar beyond allocation round 4. And this is fundamental to sustain growth in renewable capacity, to meet those net zero ambitions and to provide that confidence to the supply chain. We also welcomed the ambition set out recently by the Scottish Government to deliver between 8 to 12 gigawatts of new additional installed onshore wind by 2030. And we look forward to the publication of the next onshore wind policy statement. But we need to move beyond statements and ambition to actual things that can happen to make that delivery happen. 30 gigawatts of onshore wind by 2030 is something the industry is pushing for, and absolutely that sets the bar for onshore wind deployment. And if we can get the frameworks right for this delivery, it will bring a wave of green investment, speed up the already hefty pace of innovation in our industry, and deliver more jobs, more investment, and put us in a position where we can be a world leader on wind. A just transition in the energy sector is an opportunity. We can work with our stakeholders and communities so that benefit is felt far and wide. We need to be able to retain, retrain and attract new talent to equip people with the skills to meet the future demand and the green jobs of the future. We here at ScottishPower have offered a range of apprenticeship opportunities as well as a return to work programme in August. And in August, we supported the launch of a Green Jobs Workforce Academy, announcing 134 new jobs. A tip of the iceberg, shall we say. But what else? So to think about that pipeline growth that I talked about, to deliver the speed of deployment needed to reach the targets that we set, we need a strategic overhaul of the planning process, working with Scottish Government and local authorities to develop a faster planning process that can put climate mitigation at the heart of that decision making. At the moment, development processes take far too long, with projects being held up in planning and consenting process for years. We can't afford to keep delaying action to provide the green energy that our communities need and that the green jobs can be built for to help that recovery, green or whatever colour we want to call it. We need to be able to work in parallel instead of in series, and to speed up those decision-making processes, and to take account of the net zero impact of the projects that we're able to build, and see a strong independent planning process alongside that. And with those regular CFD auctions that I talked about, we need to see those support repowering, extension projects and co-located sites. These are essential for growth. As older wind farms reach the end of their operational life, a presumption in favour of repowering is absolutely key, so that these sites can be repowered using more efficient and modern turbines. So from an onshore wind perspective, it's a story of growth, but the mechanisms need to be there to support that, and I look forward to seeing the policy change needed to drive that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. And next up, we've got Sue Barr, the chair of the Marine Energy Council. And Sue's going to talk to us about marine renewables, wave and tidal. Morning, Sue.
Good morning, everyone, and many thanks, Lindsay, and to my previous speakers, as this makes my wave and tidal pitch very simple. So the UK, what we're talking about is wave and tidal stream technology, not tidal barrages, and I represent over 45 companies here in the UK who are developing innovative technology to meet those demands, this investment-led recovery that we're talking about and that Chris so rightly alluded to. We are an island nation, and we have significant maritime heritage, significant maritime activity that helps support existing industries in the seas surrounding our coastline. What we're hoping to achieve with wave and tidal technology is to support that recovery, support that economic growth, and support that route to decarbonisation that is so critically important at the moment. We have UK leadership. We lead the world in wave and tidal stream technology and have done for a number of years. We not only have the technology, we have the device developers, we have the financial institutions that know how to do this, and we also have the research and the third level academia that is supporting the innovation change. And you've heard from previous speakers about the need for this change, the need for innovation in terms of driving our systems and driving change. So with those devices, we have over 1 gigawatt of leased sites in the UK looking at deploying predominantly at the lead is tidal stream technology. These are devices that sit below the surface of the water or on the surface of the water and extract kinetic energy from the flows of water around our coastlines. The interesting point about this is that they're highly predictable. So those tides, and in some instances, the states of our waves are highly predictable. So this is a form of energy that we can predict for many, many years, form of kinetic energy that we can extract and convert to electrons down a wire. And we know how to do that. We're leading the world in that. We've got over 40 gigawatt hours of electricity from tidal stream technology around the UK coastline currently on our grid. And we've got projections that those jobs will be over 12,000 by 2040 when we look to build out this system. Some of the challenges we're seeing in terms of developing this sector are very similar to those that are being seen in other areas of renewable energy where there's new technology being brought forward. Well, there was a huge amount of investment in one of the biggest contributors to decarbonisation that we see in the UK, fixed offshore wind. Back in the days of developing that technology, it was very largely supported by the Danish government and in Denmark. So what we need now is to see the growth and the pull of that technology through into a commercialization of technology that can deliver into our energy system. This would provide local manufacturing. It provides high value exportable subsystems. We've got a global market that is sitting around 76 billion. So it's not just about developing that indigenous domestic market, and we've heard about the need for this long-term domestic plan, but it's about the export potential. And it's also about diversification. I talked about a maritime nation and the UK having some of the leading maritime technologies, expertise, engineers, offshore operations and maintenance experience that's been born out of our oil and gas sector, but also now our fixed offshore wind sector. That industry will need to diversify and it will need to grow. And the supply chain is very much geographically distributed across the UK. Studies by some of my members and by groups that are looking at how this supply chain would be stimulated show that we very much fit with that levelling up agenda and that economic growth agenda. So areas such as South Wales, the Isle of Wight, up into Caithness, into northern Scotland, Orkney, the Western Isles, are all areas where we have natural resource, and we hold 50% of Europe's tidal resource and 30% of its wave resource. It's a vast extractable resource. So we're estimating that could generate economic benefit to the UK of around 1.4 billion if it was correctly supported. And I'll revert back to that in a moment. By 2030, we can provide 20% of the UK's electricity. And the challenges that we're seeing at the moment is in terms of solving those policy asks against an industry that is trying to deliver innovation. And I think we come back to the question around how do we make this transition just? And it needs significant change. It needs a different line of thought about the long-term viability of the industries that we want to deliver, how they deliver for the UK, and what they bring in terms of meeting that 6 carbon budget. And we feel strongly that marine energy has the opportunity to do all of that. Its contribution, we're still looking at where those projects will be. But we currently have 3 projects that are eligible to bid into AR4. We've seen a change in the structuring of the contracts for difference and that market pull that's giving a route to market for the industry. And that is looking very promising for the sector. We're hoping that we can deliver some 30 to 40 megawatts in AR4. And we're working with government to think about how you can do that within a system that is set up to be highly competitive. So how do you bring innovative technologies that we know can deliver economic benefit, can deliver storage, because tidal's very, very closely linked to storage because of its predictability. It can be very compatible. We're already generating hydrogen from marine energy at the European Marine Energy Centre, and we're seeing significant economic benefits being driven out of this sector into the UK economy. How can we deliver that with a policy framework that really isn't fit for purpose for this sector? So we've worked very closely with government and we welcome the announcement of AR4. Similarly to onshore wind, we would be calling for annual auctions. We need to get these projects started and delivered. We need technology. We need at-scale volume of technology in the water, as we saw with offshore wind, fixed offshore wind, and that will allow those prices to be reduced. We're also looking at a relatively high administrative strike price at this point in time. But if we take that cost as the only value of this sector, and I think this is, again, talking about this challenge and decade of difference, we cannot think of the cost of energy as the only challenge to us. We need a just transition. We need economic growth here in the UK. And certainly the marine energy industry stands well to support that. So our call really is for annual rounds. It is for a provision, a minima for marine energy that would allow the projects that we know are eligible to come forward to deliver in this round and start us on that journey of seeing 1 gigawatt of development out to the end of 2030s of our indigenous resources around the UK coastline. And we hope to bring the supply chain, the jobs, the diversification from our existing industries with us on that journey. So on that note, I will pass to the next speaker and look forward to receiving your questions. Thanks, Lindsay.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you. And good morning to Thomas McMillan, who's the chair of the Solar Energy Scotland Trade Association. Thomas, your 5 minutes starts now.
Good, thank you. Thank you for having me today on what's an extremely interesting topic. In preparing for today's event, I give the topic a bit of thought. Yes, renewables are green, but are they just? The Climate Justice Alliance define a just transition as a vision-led, unifying and place-based set of principles, processes and practices. And I think the unifying and place-based element of that statement is extremely interesting, especially in the context of solar. Within solar, we have some key attributes. Most notably, it's a modular technology and it is affordable. So by modular, we have the ability to do large-scale solar farms. I've had a lot of success in this area. And solar is now competitive with wind in terms of pricing. It also gives us the ability to piggyback the wind sector's investment into the grid to get more utilization out of the grid and to help drive down costs for consumers. The more of the existing grid we can use by a range of technologies, the lower the price for the consumer. But I think most importantly, we have the micro-renewable element of solar. We can now deliver rooftop solar and levelize the cost over 25 years. And that will mean that the occupier can pay half what a supplier is currently asking them to pay. And I think that is now groundbreaking. The problem is that we have much more focus on that utility scale at the moment. As a technology, we have a reliable and easy to maintain solution. And possibly most important in terms of the agenda today and the green recovery, we have a quick deployment. For solar farms, once you have planning and grid in place, you can deliver the the solar farm in a matter of months. 50 megawatts of solar in 3 months, perhaps. We also have the ability to create heat as well as electricity. That really difficult part of decarbonising the energy sector. Not only do we have the ability to take excess electricity from solar panels deployed on sites and turn that into hot water and storage, but often the forgotten about technology of solar thermal. Please do not forget about the role that that can play. Solar is also symbiotic. It works well with heat pumps. It works well with EVs. It works well in terms of battery storage. It also will fit with the ever increasing demand of air conditioning, both in the UK and globally. So to go back to that Climate Justice Alliance definition and thinking about unifying and place-based solutions, I gave some thought to Solar Energy Scotland's 2030 target for solar deployment. We set a 6 gigawatt target. 3.5 gigawatts of that are from ground mount solar, 1.5 gigawatts from domestic, and 1 gigawatt from commercial. Is that really the right balance, though, in terms of a just transition? And why are we setting so much ground mount solar? Well, having reflected on it, I think it's because that's what the market is kind of being set up to deliver. Large-scale renewables, greenfield sites, and remote locations. But when you consider the just transition and those points of unifying and place-based solutions, we need to focus much more on domestic and commercial and rooftop solutions where people need the power, where people can drive down their energy costs on site, where they can become more efficient and more engaged in finding solutions. The challenge we have as an industry is that there's still a lot of planning barriers. The building standards have improved, but they can still get a lot better. And business rates, please do not get me started on business rates for rooftop solar. We also have challenges of access to finance for those who want to self-invest in rooftop solar. And I think Chris mentioned the investment point earlier on. So I'll leave you with this statement. If we want renewables that are unifying and place-based, solar has to be at heart of any just transition strategy, not just a side note. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Okay, right, so thank you to all of our speakers. Hopefully you found that some food for thought for what I'm hoping will be a stimulating panel discussion going forward. So there's quite a lot of comment coming in the chat about the fact that the cost of renewables has come down. It's certainly perceived as being an awful lot more affordable. And there's a need to reduce or remove tariffs. I don't know if there's a view. There's been talk about the CFD allocation round 4 throughout this. Sue's touched on it, Kate's touched on it, Chris mentioned it as well. I don't know if you've got a view. What's your take on the CFD? What's your take on tariffs and subsidy support or market support versus the merchant model? I'll kick off perhaps with Kate.
Thanks, Lindsay. Yeah, so when I touched on the CFD there in the piece about onshore wind, absolutely CFD auctions are critical for the future deployment of wind. We need that certainty, not just for ourselves, but for our supply chain too, which really touches on all the points about the economic recovery needed across the UK. There's great opportunities here for the supply chain, but we need to see that ability to invest through the certainty and the route to market that CFD brings. And that's through the regular auctions. But we also need to see that expanded out to reflect the new world of growth of renewables that we are coming into as we hybridize our sites. We need to see support for co-located technologies. We need to see that support for fully powered projects. There needs to be an evolution of the CFD. It needs to happen faster. We need to have that regularity and certainty for investment.
Thanks, Kate. Right, Sue, maybe come to you next.
Yes, I think it's a timing issue. If we're going to meet the 6th carbon budget, we need diversification of electrification of the energy system, and try saying that first thing on a Monday morning. But we need multiple technologies. We need multiple solutions, both in use of electricity, but also in generation of it. And at the moment, there are technologies that are more expensive than typical production of energy. So at the moment, yes, I think we need those subsidized systems, but we can't use that as the only metric. So we need to be looking at what do they deliver back into our economy, what diversification, what just transition do they support. And I think this alludes to something that everybody has been speaking to, which is about the need for a full system change on how we consider use and generation of electricity. And at the moment, tariffs to pull through innovation, that market pull, are important. Do we need them forever? No, I don't think we do. But I think at this stage, if we want to have a long-term horizon to decarbonise our energy system, we do need tariffs to support those technologies.
And if I can be indulgent as chair, I guess my take on it is the removal of that route to market, that and for all that CFDs are effectively subsidy free for established technologies as currently marketed, and as demonstrated by the results of the past allocation round 3 auction. I think we're now getting to the point where these are market access tools as opposed to subsidy mechanisms that are route to market to ensure that the most cost effective energy can get through to consumers. And they can also help stimulate that R&D investment as well, which is really important, as Sue's touched upon. I guess for me, the flip side of that is a merchant basis or a corporate PPA basis. Whilst I am delighted to see corporates coming into this space and effectively responding to their consumers' pressure and request for green energy, selling it only to corporates is not going to crack the nut on this. So we need multiple routes to investment, new business models coming through. And again, listening to Julian talking about the development of ancillary services based on low carbon generation has been really interesting this morning. Chris, I'm going to flip over to you just to get your tuppence worth on allocation work. But I've also got one point that I'm expecting you would like to be clarified. It's been commented here. I think folk don't quite understand what the Committee on Climate Change is and their independence, and that you're not in any way politically affiliated with who's running the gig right now. So I wanted to comment on that just to assure the audience.
Yeah, and those of you who don't follow the CCC may not know about our constitution. So we were set up by the Climate Change Act to be completely independent of government. So the work that we do has no influence from government beyond the work that we do with the analysts in government to understand some of the modelling that they do there. And our recommendations on the 6th carbon budget are just that, their advice. And we're required to give that advice every 5 years. We give advice on what we think the appropriate target should be for emissions reduction, looking out over the next 15 years or so, which we did. And the government has now implemented that target and put it into law. But we also give advice, crucially, on how we feel that target can be met. And we did an enormous piece of work in December last year looking at that challenge. So we looked at 5 different scenarios for getting all the way to net zero by 2050. Including lots of fascinating stuff about the different types of changes that we might see over the course of the next 30 years to get to that goal. But none of it is government policy. Really important to say that. So if it's true, the announcement that the Prime Minister will shortly make on decarbonising electricity entirely by 2035 was a recommendation from us back in December, but it is not a government policy until, of course, the Prime Minister has required that and asked that of his officials. So we'll see how that plays out. Just back to when it comes to the question of AR4 and the CFD, and I suppose the simple point to make is that the CFD is not a subsidy any longer, unless of course we choose it to use it in that way. And particularly when you've got gas prices as high as they are right now, it doesn't feel like a subsidy at all. It is, though, essential as a mechanism. It may well be that we see reforms to the CFD, but we'll need something like it, and that's because if we go only down a merchant basis, we get this kind of self-cannibalization that happens when the price drops. That means that eventually, it's just not possible to have a merchant-only basis for renewables at scale. Really important and really fundamental point here is that we are moving away entirely now from the old economics of energy, where what the consumer used to pay for was the thing that was being burned principally, to a world where actually that isn't the challenge, because of course the fuel for renewables is essentially zero marginal cost, it's free. So it's the capital kit that the consumer needs to pay for. And of course that's a wholly different model. And that's true regardless of the renewables technology that you use. And it's probably also true of nuclear. But it means that the government needs to set that system up so that we have some way for the consumer to repay the utility sector for that capital investment over time. And of course, at the best price for the consumer. And this is a big challenge for those particularly on the right of the political spectrum who don't like that kind of state intervention. But I'm afraid that that is here to stay in some shape or form. Now, we might see reforms to the CFD to change that. We might, for example, see something that looks more like a floor price, for example, or something like that. I can envisage that, but there needs to be something in place that gives that certainty of cash flow, so that these projects can be financed and that there is some sort of return. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And I think that would work for solar. I think that would work for tidal stream. I think it could work for a set of technologies too, as long as we are cognizant of the fact that each of them are supplying a different type of service, and that we'll need a kind of mixture of policy mechanisms to deliver the 2035 commitment that the Prime Minister hopefully will make over the course of the next few days. And I think the UK has been pioneering on this, actually. I think that the set of policies that we have in place are not bad. I'm sure they will be reformed and tinkered with over time, but I hope not extensively.
Thanks, Chris. And agree with an awful lot of what you say as per usual. Julian, I wondered if I might come to you next. You talked about the Pathfinder mechanism that National Grid are looking at, and the need to bring forward lower carbon versions of those traditional services that you could have brought to stabilise the grid. I guess I don't know if you could give some further articulation of that Pathfinder process and your timeline that you're working to. I just guess for the audience to understand a little more.
Sure. So the Pathfinder process, as I said earlier, is designed to sort of replace the services that fossil fuel generation gives you. So large rotating mass that gives you inertia and short circuit infeed. So it's quite a technical sort of aspect of operating the grid. So what we've been doing over the last 2 to 3 years is looking at those services, defining the need, not defining the solution crucially, but defining the need, and then going out to market to sort of say, look, here's our technical requirement. How could you as an industry, how can you come forward and meet this need? So we've seen some really great innovation that Statnett are commissioning something as we speak in Scotland, which is a large rotating system stabilizer, which was a brand new innovative technology from GE in Rugby. So again, UK sort of manufacturing. But we're also seeing the advent of sort of grid forming inverters on wind farms, and the Salek wind farm is a great example actually of how you can invest in a wind farm and make it provide those services that are historically come from fossil fuel generation. We recognise that this is a nascent market, so therefore we are looking to give sort of 10-year contracts for these products, so people have that sort of investment security and certainty, so we can bring this new technologies to market. What it's also doing is bringing in new players as well, so it's new forms of capital investment, new technologies and new players that are not used to working in the electricity market. So it's been hugely successful. Phase one, we signed the contracts last January. We've got Cruachan, which is providing a stability service, Deeside, which is a repurposed CCGT, which is now zero carbon in North Wales. And as I say, the Statnett solution in Keith, which is commissioning as we speak. So this is the beginning of a chain of sort of new investments that are coming onto the system between now and 2025 that enable us to operate at zero carbon in 2025.
Exciting times. Thanks, Julian. I guess, Thomas, I was wondering if I could bring you in at this point. You talked a lot about the scale of solar and that sort of small to large and the current interest really in utility scale. What do you see as being the policy nudge that's needed to get smaller scale solar away?
I think the challenge with solar is that it's multiple things. So I spoke about the planning. So in the Scottish context, we still have permitted development that's only allowed on 50 kilowatt schemes, and in England it's 1 megawatt. With building standards, there's lots of changes being made around building standards, and there's I think a challenge around those setting the building standards, looking at holistic solutions and looking at all elements of how energy and infrastructure interrelates, and you often find that there's not a joined up approach. So we do see changes with building standards where you could end up with less solar on rooftops because the grid's been decarbonised. So they're not giving a value to the generation on site and the value that can have in terms of reducing the amount of overall investment in the grid. And then there's business rates, which I touched upon, and we currently have a tax system that leads to about 30% of the saving for an occupier, business occupier, being paid back in business rates. And I think that's one of the difficult things with the solar sector, particularly the rooftop solar sector, is that it's many things across many parts of government, and because of that it starts to feel too hard for policymakers to fix, and I think that's why we've seen much more utility scale solar farms and other renewables, because it seems to be that there's a bit more of a kind of silver bullet that can be taken to those technologies. So it's about, for me, getting all parts of government engaging and setting really clear, bold targets. And I think we do have, targets set for 2050 that are very clear. But I think we do need closer target set and clearer targets for local authorities and the devolved governments. So in the case of Scotland, having a solar specific target in the same way that we have targets for offshore wind, because then that gives those government agencies, the civil servants within the planning and the building standards and the building rates departments, a focus about where we need to get to and how they need to contribute to us getting to that target.
A lot to do then. I think that's part of the theme that we're hearing from what everyone's talking about. Bruce, coming back to you, and in terms of you with your UKRI hat on, you're talking about those hard to get to portions of the economy, those energy intensive processes. We had some questions earlier on. You talked about the customer being the master, and the industry themselves were subservient to that. How do you see that pressure manifesting within those sectors? How do you see the customer as the master? Is it the likes of potentially a ScottishPower as an investor saying, I need some greener supply chain activity, or how do you see that interaction working, and how do you see that discussion changing?
So I think I see the discussion changing, and let's take. Sorry, I'll come back to energy and power in a minute, but if we take packaging, then the likes of I don't know, Diageo, Procter and Gamble, people who need tins, glass containers, to supply all of the products that we buy on an everyday basis. They do appear to be quite rapidly now changing their approach and backing up the words that they're putting in the public domain about how they are going to decarbonise themselves and their supply chains by often 2030, 2035 now they're all talking about. And that is actually driving them to come and have more conversations about, okay, so I'm committing myself to this. How on earth am I going to do it? And that's leading to those sort of conversations. So for instance, as a challenge, we funded something, a new organisation by the name of Glass Futures, which is building a new technology development centre in St Helens, the home of British Glass and Pilkington. But actually, the whole of the glass sector has come together to say we need to work as a sector, and indeed with other foundation industry sectors, on the technologies and the products that those customers needs, and that has brought a number of those customers to talk to them because they see that there's somewhere to go. So, you know, there are developing programs in that area, and that's enabled through either my program or, for instance, the Bay fuel switching program, for trials to be starting to happen where 100% biofuel has been used to make glass. But those trials were done in conjunction with the likes of Diageo and Heineken. And now they go, okay, so we understand it can be done. I'm not going to go into any numbers. They also understand that at the moment, doing that does cost more than the normal production. But they because they've been partners in that, they understand what it means and what they need to do to help to bring that cost closer to where we are today, but ultimately where they might be in terms of what they're going to have to spend to get the packaging products that they need in the really quite short term now. So those sort of processes are ongoing, and I'd really love to see that starting to happen more and more in sectors such as construction. But there it might be that the government needs to take a much bigger lead, because they're responsible. The figure I have in my head, and others may tell me wrong, is 70% of procurement in big construction projects is effectively from the government. So they need to take a lead there. So I'd like to see that. But other sectors, you know, whether it's in the energy space or automotive, aerospace, I think the opportunity is to do similar things for all of those sectors. And that's really how I'd like to see it go forward.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. I mean, I guess just in summing up, I'm hearing a lot about people, policy transition and partnerships and collaboration. So whether you're sitting as government, a trade association, a financier, an investor, a developer, a technology innovator as well, it does sound as though there's a need for us all to be doing more and moving with pace as well. We have just got 4 short minutes as we come to close. If I do a quick fly round, I'm looking for 3 words that you think would typify the action that is required between now and 2025, and I'll take it in order of speakers. So I'll start with Chris. Just 3 words of action point that you think we need to get moving on.
Well, I mean, I'm on the spot here, so I'm going to say pace, I'm going to say ambition, and I'm going to say bravery. That's what we need really over the next period. If we get those 3 things in place from our political leaders, and I'm afraid it is about the politicians, then I think we can be motoring on this.
Excellent, thank you. Over to Bruce, 3 words from you, just giving your slightly different perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I'm afraid I completely agree with Chris on pace. Yeah, and I'm expecting actually that's going to get a number of ticks. I think accountability, which was highlighted by the report I mentioned earlier from the CBI and Make UK, everybody's got to take accountability for this and their responsibility within the journey to a just transition. And then finally, I think it's about delivery, not waiting for unicorns. Yeah, we've got to deliver now. Yeah, and get on with it.
I like that. No unicorns. Don't have time for them. Okay, good. Excellent. Julian.
So I think my words will be whole system planning.
Whole system planning. Like it. End to end. Comprehensive and complete. Kate, on to you.
Thanks, Lindsay. I would say policy deployment and visibility of future market. It's probably more than 3 words, but we'll call them 3 phrases.
Sue, for our penultimate trio.
Well, I'm going to be controversial and say not just cost. So we need to derive economic benefits from what we're doing. And as we all said, this needs to be a just transition to a greener economy.
Okay. And Thomas, finally, last but not least.
I think there's often a presumption to say no as a default position. And if we're going to meet the targets, then my 3 words would be just say yes.
Just say yes. Excellent. Okay, there we go. Okay, so thank you to all of our speakers. It's no mean feat juggling 6 of you. Thank you for this great opening session for Decarbonise Week. You've heard it here this morning. You've heard about pace, ambition, bravery, deliverability, whole system. Just say yes was a nice way to close as well. This is a decade of difference. There's a massive opportunity, both economically in terms of job creation, transition from old to a new way, a new normal, and we get to actually clean our act up as we go along. And there has to be the economic benefit in there in terms of supply chain, cost to consumer, and transitioning our lives to a much more sustainable and clean future. I'm very much looking forward to hearing the rest of the discussion across this week as part of Dcarbonise. And thank you very much for joining us for that first session, and thank you to the panel as well. Thanks, everybody.